What if one morning, you woke up, and the richest man on Earth wasn't on Earth anymore? The morning Elon Musk disappeared, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The stock market opened as usual. Twitter was still chaotic. Tesla released a routine press update. And yet, something felt off. There were no tweets. No live streams. No cryptic X posts. Elon Musk had gone silent. At first, people thought it was a stunt. He'd done stranger things, naming his kid after an aircraft, challenging Vladimir Putin to a fistfight, changing Twitter's logo to a Shiba Inu for fun. But by midday, whispers turned into trending hashtags. Hashtag where is Elon? Hashtag Red Planet Musk. Hashtag Musk vanished. Then came the official statement from SpaceX. Mr. Musk is currently on sabbatical, off-grid, focusing on long-term sustainability projects. That vague PR sentence only fanned the flames. Off-grid? Elon. The man who practically lived online. Across newsrooms, bunkers, Reddit threads, and shady forums, a theory began to form. 3 days after the disappearance, an anonymous source leaked satellite data. A massive, unregistered SpaceX launch had taken place from a private launch facility in the middle of the Atacama Desert. Not Boca Chica. Not Cape Canaveral. Completely off the books. The spacecraft was unlike anything seen before. Not Starship. Bigger. Sleeker. Rumors called it Phoenix. It left Earth's atmosphere without clearance, slipped past the ISS's orbital path, and vanished. Destination? Unknown. Except one person knew exactly where it went. Her name was Julia Park, a former propulsion engineer at SpaceX who quit 5 months before Elon's disappearance. In an exclusive interview, recorded in a grainy hotel room, her face partially obscured, Julia dropped a bombshell. He's not dead. He's not kidnapped. He's not hiding. Elon Musk is on Mars. Right now. Living there. Breathing there. Building something. Her voice cracked with something between awe and fear. He didn't just want to visit Mars. He wanted to own it. The world flipped. CNN ran back-to-back segments on The Martian Billionaire. Joe Rogan called it the biggest baller move in human history. Governments demanded answers. Was it legal to leave Earth without permission? Did Musk just create the first extraterrestrial sovereign individual? More troubling than his absence was the silence. Elon wasn't broadcasting from Mars. He wasn't sending photos. Not even a damn selfie in a space helmet. No messages. No live stream. No quirky updates. Just radio silence. And that terrified everyone. Because when Elon Musk isn't telling you what he's doing, he's probably building something that could change the world. Or end it. By all metrics, Elon had won. Tesla hit a $3 trillion market cap. Starlink dominated satellite internet. Neuralink was running brainwave experiments in over 30 countries. SpaceX had sent more people to orbit than NASA. So why leave? Insiders say he was burned out. Decades of criticism. Lawsuits. Divorce. Betrayals from within his companies. Some said he couldn't handle being idolized and demonized at the same time. But others? They believe he was preparing for something far worse. Something he saw coming. Climate collapse. AI dominance. Political decay. Maybe Mars wasn't a vanity project. Maybe it was an arc. Late one night, a strange post appeared on a locked SpaceX GitHub server. It was encrypted, but hackers cracked it in under 12 hours. The file was titled, redbase_operational_log001.txt. Lines of code. Power metrics. Oxygen levels. Plant growth data. A timestamp. Sol 03, human status, stable. System status, nominal. Progress, 4%. Red base. It wasn't just a nickname. It was real. Elon Musk had built the first permanent human base on Mars. Alone. Secretly. And had been living there, by the logs, for 3 sols, Martian days, before the world even realized he was missing. And the scariest part? It looked like he'd planned to never come back. A quote from one of his old interviews started circulating again. It hit different this time. If something is important enough, even if the odds are against you, you should still do it. Elon Musk. Maybe this was it. The final gamble. The ultimate mission. No press. No praise. No plan B. Just a man, a planet, and an idea too big for Earth. As speculation hit fever pitch, another anomaly was discovered, a new satellite in Mars orbit. Sleek. High bandwidth. Privately owned. It was broadcasting a faint, repeating signal. A sequence of beeps. Then a voice. 5 words. On a loop. Over and over. Day 1. Life begins now. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Before he became the man who vanished into the stars, Elon Musk was just a boy, skinny, awkward, wide-eyed, with a mind far too big for the world he was born into. Pretoria, South Africa. 1984. 12-year-old Elon sat cross-legged on the dusty rooftop of his house, gripping a second-hand telescope, scanning the sky for Mars. The red dot shimmered faintly above the horizon, but for Elon, it wasn't just a planet. It was freedom. Escape. A place that could be better than Earth, if someone dared to build it. Down below, chaos reigned. His father, Elon Musk, was yelling again. Something about the electricity bill. Elon's younger brother Kimball had snuck out, and their mother, May Musk, was trying, once again, to hold everything together. She was tough, stunning, and endlessly patient, working late hours as a model and dietitian to keep food on the table. But for Elon, peace lived in silence, in the blue glow of computer screens and the slow drift of stars. The moment he learned how to code, it was like someone handed him a secret key to another universe. By age 12, he built and sold his first game, Blaster, a crude pixelated shooter he coded in BASIC. He made $500 and promptly spent it all on computer parts. But his wins didn't impress the kids at school. They bullied him. Brutally. One day, they threw him down a concrete staircase, breaking his nose and knocking him unconscious. It wasn't just physical, it was a message: you don't belong here. And honestly, they were right. While other kids played soccer, Elon devoured encyclopedias. Tolkien. Asimov. Douglas Adams. He didn't just read The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. He believed in it. The universe, he learned, was absurd. But that was no excuse to stop asking questions. What is the meaning of life, the universe, and everything? The book's answer was 42. Elon wanted to build the calculator. When he turned 17, Elon made the boldest move of his young life. He left. Alone. One-way ticket to Canada. $2,000 in his pocket. No job. No connections. Just the belief that North America held the future. "I'm going to America," he told his mom. "Why?" she asked, worried. "Because that's where the big stuff happens," he said. Fast forward to college. Elon was broke, sleep-deprived, and always working on 5 things at once. He couldn't stop. He refused to live a small life. While studying at the University of Pennsylvania, he double-majored in physics and economics. His roommate said he didn't just talk about tech, he talked about colonizing Mars like it was something you could do next weekend. Earth is just the launch pad, he'd say. Mars is the destination. In 1996, he dropped out of a Stanford PhD program after 2 days. Instead, he co-founded Zip2, a city guide software for newspapers. It wasn't glamorous, mostly long hours and late-night debugging, but it got him his first taste of real success. He sold it for $307 million. Then came PayPal. The idea: send money online with just an email address. People thought he was nuts. He sold that too, $1.5 billion. He could have stopped there. Bought an island. Started a VC fund. Golfed. But Elon Musk didn't want yachts. He wanted rockets. In 2002, he founded SpaceX, and from day one, people laughed. A private space company? Competing with NASA? Run by an internet guy? 3 failed launches later, even his team was doubting. One more failure, and SpaceX would be bankrupt. Elon had poured every penny he had into it. The 4th rocket launched on September 28, 2008. It made it to orbit. Just barely. That same year, NASA gave SpaceX a $1.6 billion contract. The kid from Pretoria had just outplayed every aerospace giant in the world. But there was always something deeper behind the rockets. Yes, he loved tech. But he also feared something bigger, that humanity would die with Earth. Nuclear war. AI takeover. Environmental collapse. We were living on a ticking clock. So Elon made a vow, publicly. I want to die on Mars. Just not on impact. People laughed. But he wasn't joking. Tesla. Neuralink. The Boring Company. Twitter, now X. They were tools. Distractions. But the mission, was always Mars. While others saw a dead planet, Elon saw a blank canvas. He wasn't running from Earth. He was building a backup of humanity. A version 2.0. And for years, people thought it was all just talk. Until he disappeared. Now, looking back, all the clues were there. The stress. The long silences. The unspoken sadness in interviews. He didn't just want to be the first man on Mars. He needed to be. Because deep down, Elon never really felt at home on Earth. Too loud. Too slow. Too small. But Mars? Mars made sense. Elon Musk leaned back in a cheap swivel chair inside a cramped office with beige carpet and flickering fluorescent lights. He hadn't slept properly in 3 days. Pizza boxes stacked near his desk. The smell of cold coffee mixed with ozone from overheating computer towers. But he was thriving. The internet was the Wild West, and Elon? He was riding in guns blazing. With the sale of Zip2 still fresh in the bank, Elon rolled the dice again, this time with something far bolder. He called it X.com, a simple name for a revolutionary idea: online banking before anyone trusted the internet. Even his investors were confused. Why not call it something more friendly? Something people get? Because I don't want them to get it yet, Elon said, eyes lit up. I want them to get it later, after it changes everything. That was Elon's way. Always 5 steps ahead. Always betting on what could be, not what was. And Silicon Valley didn't know what to do with him. At first, Elon fit the mold: young, sharp, dressed like a guy who slept under his desk, because he did. He knew how to pitch. Knew how to code. Knew how to grind. But there was something different about him. He didn't want just a billion-dollar company. He wanted to shape civilization. That made people uncomfortable. X.com eventually merged with a competitor called Confinity. The product? PayPal. The new leadership didn't love Elon's vision for banking. He wanted to go bigger, riskier, faster. They voted him out as CEO. While he was on his honeymoon. It was his first major betrayal. But instead of sulking, Elon made a promise to himself. Never again let someone else steer the ship. If I'm going down, it's with my hands on the wheel. Flush with $180 million from the PayPal sale, Elon could have coasted. Early retirement. Hawaiian beach. New ventures in real estate or crypto. Instead, he looked up. And he saw Mars. Why hasn't NASA sent people there yet, he kept asking. The answers frustrated him: too expensive. Too risky. No demand. So he did the unthinkable. He tried to buy a rocket from Russia. They laughed him out of the room. And in classic Musk fashion, he responded. Screw it. I'll build my own. A dusty warehouse in El Segundo. That's where SpaceX began. No NASA scientists. No aerospace royalty. Just a bunch of nerds with dream-level ambition and the audacity to think they could compete with Boeing and Lockheed Martin. It was chaos. They were underfunded, overworked, and constantly doubted. 3 launches. 3 failures. The third rocket exploded 2 minutes into flight. That was supposed to be the end. Elon had poured everything he had into the company: money, time, reputation. He was broke. Tesla was also hemorrhaging cash. Investors were calling. Reporters were circling. Then, one shot left. Elon gathered the team in the hangar. We have one more rocket. One more chance. Either we make it, or we die trying. September 28, 2008. Everyone at SpaceX held their breath. The rocket launched. It passed Max Q. It hit orbit. Perfect. Cheers erupted. Engineers cried. SpaceX became the first privately funded company to send a liquid-fueled rocket into orbit. In that moment, Musk didn't just prove his doubters wrong, he rewrote the rules of aerospace. And then, like some divine reward for not giving up, NASA called. They awarded SpaceX a $1.6 billion contract. The same man Silicon Valley pushed out of PayPal was now their biggest hope in space. While building rockets by day, Elon was also saving Tesla by night. The electric car startup was burning cash faster than it could raise it. At one point, the company had barely enough money for a few weeks of payroll. Elon did the unthinkable again. He wired his last $20 million into the company. Either I fund Tesla, or it dies. I'm all in. Tesla survived. Barely. And when the Model S finally launched, it didn't just silence critics, it made them believers. Suddenly, every automaker was scrambling to catch up. The pressure never stopped. Investors wanted quick returns. Reporters smelled blood. Every delay, every glitch, every fiery rocket became a headline. Worse, Elon's personal life was unraveling. Divorces. Public feuds. Rumors. Tabloids painted him as a genius on the edge. A ticking time bomb. And maybe he was. He slept at the factory. He barely saw his kids. His hands trembled from caffeine and stress. He was pushing past what any human should. But he refused to stop. Because deep down, he feared something more than failure. As the 2010s passed, Elon stopped feeling like a part of Silicon Valley. The other billionaires were buying yachts and ski chalets. He was reading The Martian and building underground tunnels to fix LA traffic. He clashed with politicians. Mocked regulators. Fired people on impulse. Turned Twitter into a war zone. But behind the chaos, one mission remained crystal clear. Everything, the rockets, the cars, the satellites, the brain chips, was a means to one end. We need to be a multiplanetary species. Period. And so, as the tension on Earth rose, politics, climate, pandemics, Elon began withdrawing. Fewer interviews. Fewer appearances. More time in Texas, near Starbase. He wasn't just preparing rockets anymore. He was preparing himself. But not in some grand televised moment. No national anthem. No countdown. Just silence. And somewhere beyond the stratosphere, a single ship drifted into darkness, carrying the man who refused to wait for the future. So he went and built it himself. They thought it was a marketing slogan. Making life multiplanetary. A clever tagline for a rocket company. Something to slap on the side of a conference booth or plaster across a sleek promotional video. But to Elon Musk, it was never branding. It was doctrine. And while others were chasing valuations and IPOs, Elon was chasing Mars, relentlessly, obsessively, and without compromise. He didn't see it as some grand science fiction dream. To Elon, it was simple math. One planet plus one mistake equals extinction. Earth is fragile, he said once in a 2017 interview. We're a single-point failure system. All it takes is one asteroid, one engineered virus, one rogue AI. He always trailed off there, as if his mind was already scanning the skies for the countdown. To some, it sounded dramatic. But to Elon, it was reality. He didn't just want to reach Mars. He wanted to build a city there. It began with sketches. Then schematics. Then full-on prototypes rising from the desert sands of Boca Chica, Texas, a sleepy coastal town turned spaceport. Starship wasn't a regular rocket. It was fully reusable. Massive. Stainless steel. It looked like a 1950s sci-fi prop, but it was real, testing, exploding, evolving. People laughed when early prototypes failed. SN1. Boom. SN3. Crumpled like a soda can. SN4. Fireball. But Elon didn't flinch. Failure is an option here. If things are not failing, you are not innovating enough. Each explosion was a lesson. Each crater, a stepping stone. Behind closed doors, Elon had a 1,000-year vision. Colonies. Greenhouses. AI-managed terraforming. Autonomous mining bots. Even Martian laws. He once tweeted that SpaceX wouldn't recognize Earth-based laws on Mars. The more he built, the more obsessed he became. He stopped going to social events. Pulled away from public company duties. Even Twitter became quiet, save for the occasional cryptic Mars emoji or photo of a new Starship test. He wasn't drifting away from Earth. He was detaching. Because it's hard. That was always part of the answer. Mars wasn't convenient. It wasn't cozy. It was 140 million miles away, frozen, airless, and bathed in radiation. But Elon loved the challenge. And more than that, he loved the symbolism. Mars is a blank slate. A place where we can start fresh, without the weight of human history pressing down on us. It wasn't just a planetary mission. It was a spiritual one. That year changed everything. Earth was spinning faster, figuratively. Wars. Blackouts. AI uprising debates. A Category 6 hurricane hit Florida. New York's air quality dropped below survival levels for a week. Suddenly, Elon's Mars obsession didn't look so crazy. Investors stopped rolling their eyes. World leaders started calling. What would it take, they asked, to send people, just in case? But Elon wasn't interested in escape plans for the rich. Mars isn't a lifeboat, he said. It's a life plan. While Starship prototypes were launching in the open, behind the scenes, a different project was underway, Red Base. Using a combination of remote-controlled drones, AI logistic systems, and lunar-hardened robots, Elon began sending modules to Mars, tiny habitats, solar farms, oxygen generation units, and regolith processing labs. They arrived silently. Landed softly. Buried themselves under Martian soil. No press releases. No tweets. Just progress. People close to him said he changed in those years. He was still sharp, maybe sharper, but more distant. Less reactive. More philosophical. He spent hours in simulation rooms, walking virtual Martian landscapes, talking to AI co-pilots. He began meditating. Reading ancient Stoic texts. Studying systems theory and evolutionary biology. If I'm building the next version of human civilization, he said once to his inner circle, I need to understand how the first one broke. By 2027, Elon started pulling away completely. He handed more power to lieutenants at Tesla and SpaceX. Board meetings turned into 5-minute check-ins. Public appearances. Gone. Interviews. Declined. Only one place remained his full obsession, Starbase. And one project, Phoenix. The name said it all. A sleek, upgraded version of Starship, longer range, more shielding, AI-assisted navigation. Designed for a single mission. No crew rotation. No planned return. Just Elon, a small team of machines, and everything needed to survive on Mars. It was the most ambitious mission in human history, and almost no one knew it was real. Until it launched. Before he left, Elon recorded one last video log. It never aired. It sat in a SpaceX server under biometric lock. But a leaked transcript would later circulate online. If you're watching this, I'm not on Earth anymore. Don't panic. I didn't abandon the planet, I just wanted to prove it was possible to build something more. We are more than consumers and tweets and petty arguments. We are builders. And I needed to go where no one had gone, to remind you of that. Mars isn't a fantasy. It's a mirror. The question is, what do you want to see reflected back? The night before the launch, the air in Starbase felt different. It wasn't the usual hum of engines or the constant chatter of engineers and technicians. This time, everything was quiet, eerily so. Even the stars above seemed to dim, like they too were holding their breath. The grand spaceport in Texas, once filled with the feverish energy of rockets rising to the sky, was now an almost sacred site, the epicenter of a journey none could have anticipated. Elon Musk stood on the balcony of his private quarters, staring out at the vast, black expanse of the Texan desert, illuminated only by the harsh floodlights of Starbase. His thoughts were far away, 1,000,000 miles away, to be precise. For the first time in years, he felt an unusual weight on his shoulders. Not from the years of corporate battles, not from the constant expectation, but from the finality of this moment. Tomorrow would be the moment that changed everything. Tomorrow, he would leave Earth behind. He had made this decision months ago, maybe even years ago, in the back of his mind, before anyone else could comprehend it. Mars was always the endgame. But stepping into the unknown, leaving behind everything he had fought for on Earth, the companies, the fans, the billions who looked to him as a messiah of progress, it was different than he imagined. Elon had always been a man who faced the future with relentless certainty, yet now, standing at the precipice of the unknown, he was overcome by the quiet complexity of his decision. What would the world think? What would the people who had trusted him, his team, his family, even his children, say when they realized he was not just leaving for a few months, but for good? He had explained it 100 times before, humanity needed to be a multiplanetary species. The mission was too important. The stakes were too high. But now that the moment was here, with his hands gripping the edge of the unknown, there was a small voice inside him, barely audible, that asked, what if I'm wrong? What if I've miscalculated? Elon shook the thought off. There was no turning back. In the days leading up to the launch, his team had worked with tireless intensity. They were all in this with him, even though none of them knew what this really meant. But tonight, before the journey to Mars could begin, Elon had to say goodbye. First, to Tesla. The company he'd saved from near collapse, the electric car revolution that he'd spearheaded, had its own momentum now. Its future was no longer tied to his personal presence. The board, the engineers, the visionaries who took the torch from him, they would carry it forward. He was no longer needed. And then, there was SpaceX, his heart. The company that had absorbed his mind, his soul, his energy. It was his company in a way that Tesla, no matter how revolutionary, could never be. The rockets, the engineering, the mission to reach Mars, it was all deeply personal. But Elon knew something others didn't: Mars wasn't a destination. It was a reflection. And as he stood at the control room for the last time, saying his goodbyes to the team that had helped him shape humanity's future, he realized something. The true test wasn't whether Mars was reached or not. The test was whether the human spirit could transcend its limitations. Whether they could overcome their fears, their doubts, and their failures. Elon smiled. I've always said that the way to predict the future is to create it. I didn't create the future. We did. With a soft nod, he turned away from the control room and walked down the hallway. It was his last walk through Starbase. Elon didn't sleep that night. He couldn't. The buzz of last-minute preparations, the hum of the countdown clock, the thought that this would be his last time standing on Earth, all of it pressed in on him. By dawn, the SpaceX facility was a living, breathing machine. The final tests had been run. The Phoenix ship, gleaming and massive, stood ready on the launch pad, its massive engines thrumming in anticipation. It was time. He stood alone in front of the rocket. The wind swept across the vast desert around him. The sight of the craft, towering above him, was magnificent. This wasn't a normal rocket launch. This was the birth of a new era. This was the moment when humanity's future expanded beyond Earth. But it wasn't lost on him, this was a deeply personal mission. A mission that wasn't just about Mars. It was about understanding the limits of human ambition. About seeing how far one could push the boundaries before they cracked. He was leaving Earth, but in some strange way, he was also taking Earth with him, every idea, every doubt, every moment of failure that led him here. The only thing that remained now was the decision. Elon stepped up to the hatch. He could feel the heavy weight of his decision in every step. He turned around, facing the small group of engineers and astronauts who would accompany him. "Are you sure?" one of the engineers asked, his voice a whisper. "I've never been more certain," Elon replied. The hatch closed behind him. As the engines roared to life and Phoenix slowly lifted off the launch pad, Elon's heart raced. The ground fell away, and the sky turned black. The world he'd known for so long, Silicon Valley, rockets, electric cars, fame, and fortune, was now a memory. As the ship climbed higher, Elon looked out through the glass at the shrinking Earth below. It was smaller now. Just a dot. A blue marble, drifting in the void. He was alone. The thought would have terrified a lesser man. But to Elon Musk, it was freedom. The freedom to shape something far beyond the confines of Earth, far beyond the limits of what everyone thought was possible. And so, he did. He set his eyes on Mars, knowing that the true test had just begun. The ship creaked as it descended, the engines roaring with power as Phoenix cut through the thin Martian atmosphere. Despite the advanced technology, the landing felt raw and real, like the first step into an unknown wilderness. Elon Musk sat in the cockpit, his fingers lightly grazing the controls, his eyes fixed on the planet he had dreamed of for years. Mars was no longer a distant goal. It was his new home. The barren, red landscape spread before him, harsh, unforgiving, but full of possibility. With a soft thud, the spacecraft's landing gear kissed the Martian surface. The ground rumbled slightly, as though Mars itself was waking up to greet its new inhabitants. The air was thin, and the wind howled outside, but inside the capsule, Elon was silent, staring out through the thick, reinforced glass. He had made it. They had made it. The team of engineers, the robots, the years of preparation, all had led to this moment. Phoenix had arrived. Elon stood slowly, his legs stiff from the long journey. The moment of glory was overshadowed by something far more important. The real work was about to begin. Stepping outside the ship, Elon was met by the cold Martian wind. It hit him with a sharp, dry sting. But he didn't flinch. He had anticipated it, prepared for it. His boots crunched against the red soil as he took his first steps, the desolate expanse stretching out before him. There was no going back now. Behind him, the rest of the crew unloaded essential equipment. They were a small team, engineers, scientists, a few medical personnel, and a handful of autonomous drones. But their mission was clear: transform this inhospitable world into a place where humans could live and thrive. They set to work immediately, assembling solar panels, building the first layer of the habitat domes, and checking the air filtration systems. This wasn't just a visit, this was the first step in colonizing Mars. Mars was silent. It was a silence that wasn't peaceful, but oppressive. Even with the hum of machinery around him, Elon couldn't shake the feeling that he was utterly alone. No sounds of birds, no rustling of leaves, no distant hum of cars or chatter in a cafe. Just the wind, the sound of boots on red dust, and the whisper of his breath through the oxygen mask. The silence grew louder the longer he stayed. He had anticipated the isolation, had trained for it, but nothing could have fully prepared him for the weight of this loneliness. Earth seemed like a distant memory, a dream from a previous life. And the reality of Mars was far from the excitement of the launch. It was gritty, unforgiving. And yet, there was a certain peace in it. The first few weeks were exhausting. There was no time to pause and reflect, every moment was spent on the grind of survival. The robots worked tirelessly, unloading supplies and setting up essential systems. Water recycling systems. Oxygen generators. Greenhouses for food. Communication arrays. Each piece of equipment was another step toward sustainability. But it wasn't enough. Mars wasn't ready to be home. There were setbacks. Power failures. Pressure leaks in the habitat modules. Even a few minor explosions in the hydroponic labs as they tested the growing conditions for food. But Elon wasn't fazed. He had always known that nothing worthwhile came without struggle. And yet, the realization began to settle in: Mars was not Earth. There was no natural wealth here. No fertile soil. No oceans. No mountains to climb. No ecosystems to depend on. Every single thing had to be engineered. Every step forward felt like an uphill battle. But for Elon, this was the challenge he was born to take on. There was no turning back. This was the future of humanity, his future, and it would be shaped by his hands. As the sun set on the Martian horizon, the sky turned a deep, muted red. The stars shone brighter than ever before. Elon sat alone in the observation dome, gazing out at the vast emptiness that stretched before him. For a moment, he allowed himself to feel small. The red dunes and jagged cliffs seemed to go on forever, like an unbroken sea of rock and dust. Mars had been here for billions of years, indifferent to the petty struggles of humanity. But now, a new chapter was being written. The planet that had once seemed so distant, so unreachable, was now a new frontier for humankind. Elon pulled out his tablet and opened a message from his children. It was short, as messages took several minutes to reach Earth, but it was enough to remind him of what he had left behind. His kids, the foundation of everything he had worked for. He paused before typing a response. But instead, he closed the device, his thoughts racing. This was his journey now. He couldn't allow the tether to Earth to hold him back. He had made his choice, and it had to be absolute. A few days later, as the work continued, something remarkable happened. The first crop sprouted. It wasn't much, just a few small shoots of lettuce and potatoes, but it was enough to send a surge of hope through the crew. For the first time, something alive had grown in Martian soil. This wasn't just survival. This was life, beginning to take root. The crew gathered around the small hydroponic farm, marveling at the progress. Elon stood back, a rare smile spreading across his face. It wasn't much yet, but it was a start. They had turned the impossible into the possible. And for a brief moment, the vastness of Mars didn't feel so lonely. The next few months were filled with more progress, small victories, one after the other. More crops grew. The habitat domes became more advanced, with better temperature regulation and air quality. The first rudimentary mining operations began, extracting water from the frozen underground reservoirs. But despite the advancements, there was a lingering truth that couldn't be ignored: this was still Mars. Everything had to be earned. Nothing was easy. Every small success was tempered by new challenges, systems failures, limited resources, and the ever-present threat of equipment breakdowns. The Martian settlers were resilient, but they were only human. And Mars, for all its potential, had no mercy. Mars was not a gentle world. Though Elon Musk and his small crew had established the foundations of a colony, every new day brought with it a fresh reminder of just how unforgiving the red planet could be. Even with all the technology and ingenuity at their disposal, the Martian environment was a constant adversary. The winds howled outside, the dust storms swept over their habitat domes, and every breath they took felt like they were stealing it from a world that didn't want them here. But despite the challenges, there was an undeniable sense of progress. They were survivors. They had overcome the first major hurdle, getting to Mars and establishing a foothold. Now, the real work began. A few months into their settlement, the first resupply mission arrived from Earth. It was a historic moment. The cargo ship, Starlink 7, descended through the thin Martian atmosphere, carrying with it critical supplies, more food, additional mining equipment, a few more settlers, and, most importantly, the promise that the dream of a Martian colony was growing beyond the initial dream. Among the new arrivals were a group of engineers and scientists whose primary focus was one thing: self-sustainability. They were tasked with improving the infrastructure, expanding the energy grid, and designing the next generation of agricultural systems. For Elon, this was both a relief and a challenge. The small colony was growing, but it was still incredibly fragile. The hope was that with more skilled workers and more resources, the colony could one day stand on its own 2 feet, independent of Earth. As the cargo ship landed, Elon couldn't help but feel a surge of optimism. The colony was about to become something bigger than he had imagined. But with growth came new complications, and he knew that the balance they had so carefully crafted could easily tip. The first months after the resupply were marked by a new energy. There was a palpable sense of excitement among the new settlers, but also a growing tension. The Martian environment was not only physically demanding, it was also psychologically taxing. Isolation. Constant danger. Limited resources. Every decision felt monumental. Despite the best efforts of the leadership team, including Elon, the cracks began to show. Workplace conflicts started to arise as differing opinions emerged about how the colony should be structured. There were those who wanted to push ahead aggressively, prioritizing expansion and industrial development. Others advocated for a more cautious approach, focusing on maintaining a sustainable, stable existence before considering any large-scale growth. A rift formed between the two factions. Elon found himself caught in the middle, trying to mediate between these differing visions for the colony's future. "I think we need to focus on developing our ability to grow food first," said Dr. Maria Huang, the colony's chief agricultural scientist, as she sat across from Elon in the command center. "If we can't feed ourselves, nothing else matters." "We can't wait forever for crops to grow," replied Ethan Carter, the chief engineer, who believed the colony needed to build larger-scale industrial operations to ensure a more robust, long-term future. We need factories. We need mining. We need to start manufacturing everything we can on Mars if we want to stand a chance. Elon rubbed his temples. These were the same debates he had faced on Earth, in boardrooms and war rooms. And yet, the stakes on Mars were much higher. A misstep here could mean the failure of the entire colony. Within weeks, the tension escalated. The engineers had begun constructing a massive underground mining facility, which would allow them to extract vital resources from Mars' crust, especially water. The idea was simple: to tap into the frozen reserves deep within Mars and convert them into liquid water. This, of course, was a necessary step for long-term sustainability. However, as the work began, unforeseen problems arose. The initial drilling caused minor structural damage to a nearby habitat dome, resulting in a brief oxygen leak and some serious alarms. "Elon, we have to stop this immediately," Dr. Huang demanded, her voice frantic as she inspected the damage. "We can't afford any more mistakes like this. If we keep pushing forward with this mining operation, we could destroy everything we've built." But Elon, standing at the doorway, could only look out at the damage and then back at the team. There was no easy answer. If they stopped now, they might run out of essential materials. If they didn't push ahead, they might remain dependent on resupply missions from Earth forever. "I understand, Maria," Elon said quietly. "But we have to find a balance. We need these resources to survive. We'll fix the damage, but we can't afford to stop progress." The rift between the two factions was growing, and Elon knew that he had to act quickly. For the first time since arriving on Mars, he felt the pressure of leadership weighing heavily on him. After days of discussions, he called a meeting with all the colony's leaders, scientists, engineers, and medical staff. They gathered in the new Mission Control Center, a space that had once been an empty room, but now buzzed with the energy of a growing settlement. "I understand that we are all frustrated. We all want what's best for Mars," Elon began. "But we're all here for one reason: to make humanity a multiplanetary species. And to do that, we need unity. We need to work together." He paused, letting the words sink in. "Mars is not Earth. We can't approach this like we would in Silicon Valley or Washington. We have to make every decision with a deep understanding of the consequences. We can't afford to be reckless." The room fell silent. "We've already made incredible progress," Elon continued. "But it's time to come together and decide how we want to proceed. I propose a new structure for the colony, one that ensures that we're all in this together. It's not just about growth. It's about sustainability, long-term success, and a vision for what humanity can become." Over the next several weeks, the colony began to coalesce around a shared vision. Elon pushed for a unified approach, one that combined industrial growth with environmental and agricultural stability. Instead of creating a system that favored one aspect of survival over another, the new goal was to create a balanced, sustainable system. The first successful harvest of crops was paired with the launch of a water extraction project that utilized the newly developed mining facility. The new Martian energy grid provided power for both mining and agricultural operations, ensuring that one system didn't drain the other. To help mediate these decisions, Elon proposed the formation of the Martian Council, a group made up of representatives from each field of expertise: agriculture, engineering, medicine, and resource management. The goal was to create a democratic system where every voice had a say in the colony's future. It wasn't perfect. There were still disagreements, still moments of tension. But slowly, over time, Mars began to feel like something more than a collection of individuals struggling to survive. It started to feel like a civilization. A Martian sunrise was a peculiar sight. Unlike Earth's slow fade into daylight, the red planet's sun seemed to burst into the sky almost instantly, casting long, eerie shadows across the barren landscape. Elon Musk stood by the observation window of the habitat dome, watching the spectacle. The planet's beauty had a way of disarming him, its stark emptiness, its promise of new beginnings. But there was no denying that Mars was still a wild frontier. And it was never going to be easy. That morning, the Martian colony had woken up to a crisis, one that would test every ounce of their willpower, ingenuity, and the unity they had spent months building. The first sign was the temperature fluctuation. The temperature control system in one of the newly constructed habitat domes malfunctioned overnight, causing the temperature inside to drop far below safe levels. By the time the engineers discovered the issue, it was clear that the damage wasn't just a malfunction. The situation was more critical than they had anticipated. Inside Red Base, the temperature inside the main living quarters was dropping rapidly. They had always known that Mars would challenge them, but no one had expected such a fast escalation. Vitals are dropping fast. We have less than 12 hours before it becomes life-threatening, said Dr. Ethan Carter, the lead engineer, as he surveyed the temperature control system's readings. This system failure is catastrophic. The environmental integrity of the entire dome is compromised. The colony had temperature-sensitive equipment, crops in hydroponic tanks, and oxygen generators that could all fail under such extreme conditions. The whole structure could be in danger. Elon stood with his arms crossed, looking at the monitors, his mind racing. The problem wasn't just the dome, it was a domino effect. If one habitat dome failed, it could trigger a chain reaction, leading to the collapse of their entire infrastructure. Can we repair the system? Elon asked, his voice sharp with urgency. It's going to take hours, at least, to bring it back online, replied Carter. And that's assuming we have all the right parts, which we might not. Elon's eyes darted to the small crew in the room, engineers, medical officers, and agricultural scientists. This was the first real test. This was the moment when the colony's survival instincts would be pushed to their limits. The crisis revealed a crucial divide within the colony. While some members, like Elon, believed they could rely on quick fixes and teamwork to get through the challenge, others were more cautious. Maria Huang, the agricultural lead, was visibly shaken by the malfunction. We can't afford to lose the crops, she said, her voice trembling. Without them, we're done for. Our food production will be decimated, and we don't have enough supplies to last another cycle. We need a longer-term solution to fix the colony's infrastructure permanently. Elon understood the gravity of what she was saying, but there was no time for long-term plans. Survival was immediate. There is no time to waste on theoreticals, he said firmly. We fix this now, and we'll deal with the rest later. But not everyone agreed. Tensions between the different factions of the colony were growing. Some wanted to prioritize fixing the temperature control system, while others demanded a more comprehensive overhaul of the colony's environmental systems to avoid future crises. We need a team to evaluate the bigger picture, not just this dome, said Ethan, the lead engineer. If we just patch this up, we're setting ourselves up for more failures down the line. We need to rethink our entire approach. As the sun set over Mars, the crew worked tirelessly to stabilize the habitat dome. Despite their efforts, the temperature inside continued to fluctuate erratically, and supplies of oxygen were slowly beginning to dwindle. The wind outside began to howl again, signaling the arrival of a massive dust storm, which would make repairs even harder. The colony was being tested like never before. The silence in the control room was thick, punctuated only by the hum of computers and the soft beeping of warning alarms. Elon walked from station to station, offering encouragement, even though he wasn't sure how much longer they could hold out. The enormity of the situation was clear: if they couldn't stabilize the colony's systems, they might have to abandon the entire operation. As the hours dragged on, the crew worked relentlessly, their faces marked with exhaustion. They were fighting against time, fighting against Mars. Each person on the team was giving everything they had, with no guarantee of success. By the early hours of the next day, Elon had made a critical decision. He called for an emergency Martian Council meeting to address the situation head-on. This is no longer just about a broken system, Elon said, standing before the group. It's about our future here on Mars. We need a solution that not only fixes this crisis but also ensures our survival long term. We can't just patch things up every time something goes wrong. If we want to thrive here, we need to change how we think about this place. Mars doesn't care about us. The council was divided. There were factions, some pushing for radical long-term plans while others argued for pragmatic short-term fixes. Elon had always been someone who believed in innovation, but in this moment, he knew that sometimes, survival meant making tough calls. Elon made a decision: the team would work in shifts, with engineers focusing on immediate repairs while agricultural scientists worked on securing food and water supplies. The main priority was the safety of the people, and that meant ensuring the dome stayed habitable until repairs could be made. At the same time, Elon ordered a full audit of all the systems: oxygen production, water extraction, food supply, energy, and waste management. He would not allow another crisis to catch them off guard again. They had survived, but they had learned a hard lesson. Mars was not forgiving, and every mistake would come with consequences. By the end of the day, the engineers managed to stabilize the habitat dome's temperature. The system was patched up, but not perfect. The air inside the dome was breathable again, and the worst of the crisis had been avoided. The colony had survived its first true test, but the victory felt hollow. In the quiet moments that followed, Elon took a step back to assess everything. The immediate crisis had been averted, but it was clear that Mars was going to demand more than they could have imagined. It wasn't just the technology. It wasn't just the science. It was the human spirit, the ability to adapt, endure, and keep pushing forward despite the odds. As the dust storm began to subside, Elon walked out into the Martian landscape. The red dust settled on his suit, but he barely noticed. There was still work to do. And he was ready for it. The Martian colony had weathered the storm, literally and figuratively. After the temperature crisis had been narrowly averted, there was a brief period of relief. The crew had managed to stabilize their habitat dome and keep the essential systems running. The Martian dust storm had passed, and life, though fragile, seemed to regain a semblance of normalcy. But deep within the colony, a new threat was silently taking root, one far less visible but no less dangerous. Mars was a cold and distant world. Beyond the physical challenges, the emotional and psychological toll on the settlers was starting to show. It had been over a year since the first settlers had touched down, and while the colony had grown in size, the number of souls stranded on this red world was still small, barely 50 people in total. There were no other cities, no other signs of life, only the endless horizon of barren landscape stretching for miles in every direction. And then there was the constant reminder of Earth's absence. Communications with Earth were intermittent at best, delayed by hours or even days. While it had been a vital lifeline during the initial stages of the colony's settlement, the distance was beginning to feel like an abyss. There was no longer anyone to turn to for advice, no one to share in their triumphs or sympathize with their failures. The settlers were alone. The psychological effects of isolation were beginning to manifest in unsettling ways. It started with small disagreements, at first, nothing out of the ordinary. Some settlers argued about resource allocation, others clashed over priorities between expanding the colony and securing long-term sustainability. But as time wore on, these disputes became more heated, more personal. Arguments grew louder, more frequent. Elon had always been a believer in the power of innovation, but he had never anticipated how much human emotion would complicate their mission. His initial optimism had been tempered by the realization that the colony was still a fragile ecosystem, one in which every interaction, every relationship, mattered more than it ever had before. At one of the daily meetings, tensions came to a head. "You're not listening." Dr. Maria Huang slammed her hand on the table, the frustration evident in her voice. "You're prioritizing the wrong things. We've barely scratched the surface of securing food supplies, and you want to send out another mining expedition." Elon could feel the weight of her words. Maria was right about the urgency of securing food, but he also knew that they needed raw materials to build a more self-sustaining colony. But his decisions were no longer being met with consensus, and that was starting to weigh on him. "Maria, I understand your concerns," Elon said calmly, trying to defuse the situation. "But we need resources to build the systems that will feed us. We're not going to make it if we only focus on short-term needs. Don't you understand?" Maria shot back. "We're going to burn out before we even get the chance to see the long term. We can't keep ignoring our immediate needs for the sake of future projections that are based on, what? Hope. We don't have the luxury of hope anymore." The room fell into an uneasy silence. Elon could feel the eyes of the crew on him, and for the first time since he'd arrived on Mars, he wasn't sure which direction the colony should go. The fractures in the colony's social fabric were becoming increasingly apparent. And that night, something happened that would make it even clearer that the tensions were more than just disagreements, they were dangerous. A key oxygen production system was sabotaged. When the engineers arrived at the system, they discovered that someone had deliberately damaged the oxygen filtration unit, causing a dangerous drop in oxygen levels inside one of the living quarters. Fortunately, the system was backed up, and there were no immediate casualties. But the act of sabotage sent a shockwave through the colony. It was a clear indication that there were some who were willing to undermine the colony's safety for their own agenda. Elon was furious. This was no longer just a disagreement over resources, it was a direct threat to the colony's survival. The sabotage set off a full-scale investigation. Elon gathered his top leaders in the command center, and they began combing through data logs, examining every inch of the facility for any clue as to who might be responsible. The investigation revealed shocking truths. Several crew members had been accessing restricted areas of the colony, areas that were meant to be monitored at all times. While no hard evidence pointed directly to anyone, Elon couldn't ignore the fact that the damage was deliberate, and that the rift within the colony had grown to the point where someone had taken matters into their own hands. Elon's mind raced. This wasn't just a malfunction or a careless mistake, it was an act of terrorism. Someone on Mars was actively trying to destabilize their efforts. But the question lingered, who would do such a thing? In the days that followed, suspicion ran high. The once tight-knit community was now fractured. Those who had previously gotten along were now at odds. Allegiances shifted, with some settlers backing the more cautious, defensive approach to the colony's future, while others doubled down on the aggressive, expansionist stance. Some of the more militant members of the colony, those who had supported Elon's grand vision of a multiplanetary civilization, began to question if the colony's survival depended on keeping everything united. They wanted to push forward faster, to embrace the aggressive expansion that Elon had once envisioned. But not everyone agreed. Maria Huang, who had always been the voice of caution, now spoke out more forcefully, warning of the dangers of pushing too hard. She had become an unlikely leader of resistance, rallying those who feared the consequences of overextending the colony's resources. In the midst of all this, Elon found himself in the hardest position yet. The people he had relied on, the people who had followed him to this distant world, were now at odds. The colony was breaking apart, and in a world where every decision carried weight, every fracture could be catastrophic. He had always believed that the key to survival was innovation, but now he realized that there was no blueprint for the human psyche in space. The future of Mars didn't just depend on the machines or the systems, it depended on the ability of the people to work together, despite their differences. And as he looked out across the barren Martian landscape, Elon knew that the real test was just beginning. Mars was still a beautiful, desolate place. The landscape was an endless stretch of red soil, craggy mountains, and the unyielding horizon. The air was thin, the winds fierce. It was a world that demanded the utmost respect, a planet that offered no second chances. But inside the walls of the Martian colony, something else was growing, a more insidious threat than the environmental challenges, a danger that threatened not just their survival, but the very foundation of their mission. The sabotage of the oxygen production system had rocked the colony, but the perpetrators had remained elusive. Elon had personally overseen the investigation, but the culprit remained hidden in the shadows. For weeks, the colony functioned under a cloud of suspicion, and paranoia slowly crept into the daily operations. No one trusted anyone fully anymore. Crew members started avoiding each other in the hallways, whispering behind closed doors. Even the tightest-knit teams began to unravel, as accusations started flying. Who had tampered with the oxygen system? Was it someone with an agenda? Or was it a desperate cry for help from a disillusioned settler? Elon had once believed that the greatest threat to the colony would be Mars itself, its harsh atmosphere, its barren landscapes, its unrelenting weather. But now, he realized that the real danger might be something far less tangible. It wasn't the storms outside, but the storm brewing within the colony's walls. The colony had been fractured ever since the sabotage, and the rift between the factions only deepened with time. The aggressive expansionists, those who believed that pushing forward, expanding the colony, and harvesting Mars's resources was the only way to ensure long-term survival, continued to push Elon for bolder action. Meanwhile, the pragmatists, led by Maria Huang, were becoming increasingly vocal in their opposition. They argued that survival, not expansion, was the priority. They saw the colony's infrastructure as fragile, its resources finite. To them, pushing forward recklessly was a recipe for disaster. Elon found himself in a delicate position. He understood both sides. He had come to Mars with a grand vision of a multiplanetary civilization. But he had also learned the hard way that they were not just explorers anymore, they were survivors. They needed to be careful, to prioritize stability. Yet the tension between the factions continued to escalate. The colony had already faced tangible challenges, temperature crises, resource shortages, and equipment failures. But as the factions grew more polarized, those challenges became compounded by human tension. Trust, once the backbone of the team, was now in short supply. Even simple tasks that had once seemed routine, became battlefields for control. Then came the final blow, a second sabotage attempt. This time, it wasn't the oxygen system. It was the water filtration system, the most critical resource of all. Without water, the colony could not survive. Elon's blood ran cold when he received the news. The filtration system had been tampered with, and if it hadn't been caught in time, it would have contaminated the entire water supply. If that had happened, the colony would have been rendered uninhabitable in a matter of days. Elon knew that this sabotage couldn't be ignored. It was no longer just a matter of damaged systems, it was an attack on the colony itself. The person responsible was not just a rogue actor, but someone who was willing to destroy their future for reasons that remained unclear. He called an emergency meeting with the core leadership team. Maria, Ethan, and the rest of the senior staff gathered around the table, their faces grim. "We cannot keep going like this," Elon said, his voice tense. "We need to find out who's doing this. We need to ensure the safety of the colony, and we need to do it now." Maria spoke up, her voice cold and resolute. "We can't just keep patching things up. We've been ignoring the root cause of this, human nature. There's a deep divide, and it's not going away unless we address it." "Then what do you suggest?" Elon asked, his tone more frustrated than he intended. "We need to focus on trust," Maria replied. "Trust isn't just about fixing equipment or making decisions. It's about fixing how we communicate, how we respect each other's differences." "I agree," said Ethan Carter, the head engineer. "But trust alone won't fix this. We need a plan. We need to figure out who's behind this before it's too late." In the following days, the colony was thrown into turmoil. Elon found himself facing the same question he had been avoiding for months: how much control should one person, or a small group of people, have over the future of the colony? The sabotage had made it clear that something more was at play than just simple disagreements. There were those who wanted to take control of Mars, to shape its future according to their own vision, no matter the cost. The underground movement within the colony was growing, quietly but steadily. There were whispers in the corridors of rebellion. Some believed that the mission had failed, that Mars was a mistake. They wanted to return to Earth, to salvage whatever they could. Others, however, were far more radical. They saw the colony as the beginning of a new era, and they would do whatever it took to secure their version of the future. But as the whispers grew louder, so did the divide. Elon's leadership was being questioned more and more, and the lines between those who supported him and those who opposed him were becoming clearer. It was no longer a question of vision or policy, it was a battle for control over the future of Mars itself. As the days wore on, Elon found himself grappling with a deep internal conflict. He had never imagined that Mars would be easy. He had always known that there would be challenges. But he had never anticipated that the greatest challenge would come from within the colony itself. Was it possible to build a new society on Mars when human nature, with all its flaws, was already threatening to tear it apart? He stood alone in the observation deck one night, looking out at the barren landscape. The stars above seemed distant, unreachable. But Mars, this cold, silent world, was his responsibility now. And it was clear that the future of humanity on this planet would depend on how well he could navigate the treacherous waters of human emotion, and how well he could unite a fractured colony. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Mars had never been a world for the faint of heart. The red planet, barren and silent, had offered little in the way of mercy. And now, as the clock ticked toward another critical decision for the colony, it became clear that Mars itself wasn't the only enemy. The real battle was happening within the walls of the colony. Elon stood at the center of the storm, knowing that things had reached a tipping point. The sabotage attempts, the mounting distrust, the fractures between the factions, everything was coming to a head. And there was one question that loomed above all others: would the colony survive its first true test of unity? In the aftermath of the sabotage of the water filtration system, a palpable tension had settled over the colony. It was no longer just a matter of resource management or scientific exploration, now, it was about survival, both of the colony and its spirit. The atmosphere was thick with suspicion. Elon could see it in the eyes of the settlers as they passed each other in the hallways. Conversations that once felt collaborative now had the edge of confrontation. Even the most basic decisions, once made with a shared sense of purpose, were now met with resistance. "It's not enough anymore to just fix things," Maria had said in their last meeting, her voice tinged with frustration. "We need to confront what's happening here. The cracks are deep. And if we don't act soon, we won't just lose systems, we'll lose the colony itself." Elon knew Maria was right. The sabotage was a symptom of something much more dangerous, the breakdown of the very core values that had once united the settlers. They were no longer just pioneers on a new frontier. They were divided, fractured, and at war with one another. It started as a whisper among the crew, but soon, a more vocal group began to gather in secret. This new faction was different, it wasn't a matter of policy anymore. It was a rebellion. Elon was not naive. He had known there were those who disagreed with his vision for Mars, but he hadn't expected open defiance. The small group began meeting at night, in the shadows, when the rest of the colony was asleep. They shared their frustrations, their fears, and, above all, their anger at Elon and his leadership. Some of the voices were familiar: Dr. Emily Rowe, a senior scientist who had once been one of Elon's biggest supporters. She was now a vocal critic, arguing that their dream of expanding to Mars was misguided. "We're pushing for the impossible," she said during one of the clandestine meetings. "The infrastructure isn't here. The people aren't ready. And we're all going to die because of it." Her words resonated with others. There was the engineer, Marco Delgado, who had always been the voice of caution, warning against pushing the limits of their technology. There were others too, people from all backgrounds, doctors, technicians, and scientists, who had come to believe that Elon's dream of a multiplanetary civilization was too risky, that the cost of trying to colonize Mars was too great. And so, a faction began to grow, a resistance within the resistance. The rebellion was no longer just an abstract threat. It was real, and it was gaining momentum. Elon had kept tabs on the small group's movements, but he hadn't anticipated how fast they would grow. And worse yet, they were being organized. A full-fledged plan to undermine his authority had taken shape. In the days that followed, Elon learned through various channels that the group had already started stockpiling resources, spare parts, food, and medical supplies, in secret. The idea was clear: they were preparing for a takeover, and they were willing to go as far as needed to bring down the current regime. Elon's worst fears were materializing. The fracture had deepened, and now, Mars wasn't just a frontier to conquer, it was a battlefield. Elon knew there was no way around it. He had to act. There could be no more half measures. The settlers would either remain united or fracture beyond repair. The unity that had brought them here was at risk, and it was time to put an end to the sabotage and the dissent. He called for a summit, a final meeting between all factions within the colony. The goal was simple: a reckoning. There would be no more hiding in the shadows, no more whispers in the hallways. Everyone would have to take responsibility for their actions, and the time for diplomacy had passed. As the crew assembled in the command center, Elon could feel the tension in the room. The rebels, led by Dr. Rowe and Marco Delgado, stood on one side. On the other, the loyalists, who still believed in Elon's vision, were tense but resolute. The air was thick with accusation and distrust. Elon stood before them, knowing that this moment would determine everything. "We've come a long way," Elon began, his voice steady but filled with resolve. "But I cannot pretend anymore that we're all on the same path. The sabotage, the distrust, it has to stop. Mars is unforgiving. If we cannot work together, we will fail. There is no middle ground." Dr. Rose spoke up, her voice sharp. "You're pushing us to the edge, Elon. You think you can just impose your vision, but you're losing the very thing that makes us human. We're not just a bunch of engineers building a machine. We're people, and we need to take care of each other." Elon's gaze hardened. "You think I don't understand that? I've sacrificed everything to be here. I'm not just here for the idea of Mars. I'm here because I believe in the people who can make it happen. But this sabotage, this division, it's not what Mars was meant to be. This isn't the future I envisioned." For a moment, there was silence. The room seemed to hold its breath, and Elon wondered if he was losing everything. But then Maria stepped forward, her voice clear and strong. "It's not just about you, Elon. It's about all of us. If we don't trust each other, we won't survive. But I still believe we can do this. Together." Elon took a deep breath. This wasn't just a choice between competing visions for Mars. This was about the very survival of the colony. "All right," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "We've reached a crossroads. We can either continue down this path of division, or we can unite and find a way forward. We'll have to make some hard choices. But this colony will only survive if we trust each other again. If we can do that, we'll have a future on Mars." The room was still, and for a moment, it felt like time had stopped. The future of the colony, of humanity's future on Mars, hung in the balance. The air in the command center felt lighter after the summit. It wasn't that all the tension had disappeared, it hadn't. But the decision to confront the rebellion head-on, to hold the summit and allow everyone to speak their truth, had opened the door. The conversation had been difficult, emotional, and raw, but in a strange way, it had also been cathartic. As Elon Musk left the command center that day, he didn't feel victorious, nor did he feel defeated. He felt something different, a kind of uncertainty mixed with a fragile sense of hope. The colony was standing on the edge of something new. The past months had torn it apart, but maybe, just maybe, they could rebuild it stronger than before. In the days following the summit, the colony began the painful process of healing. Old alliances were tested, and some members of the rebel faction, realizing their fight for control had alienated the very people they needed to survive, made the difficult choice to rejoin the fold. Elon, though he had won the battle of words, knew that the real war was just beginning. It wasn't just about silencing the rebels, it was about rebuilding trust, repairing the fractures, and setting a course forward that everyone could believe in. The colony couldn't afford to keep dividing itself. Mars demanded unity, and it demanded it now. With Maria's support, Elon pushed through a new leadership structure. It was a subtle shift but important. They had been working in teams for so long, but now they needed something stronger, a council. A council that would give every faction and every voice a say, not just in the daily operations, but in the larger vision for the future of the colony. Maria became the head of the council. She was respected by both the loyalists and the pragmatists, and her leadership provided a bridge between the two factions. Dr. Rowe, the former rebel leader, was appointed head of science and research, though under a new condition, she would have to collaborate more closely with the engineers and specialists. Marco Delgado, the cautious engineer, was tasked with overseeing the colony's infrastructure, an area he had always excelled in, and a role that required stability and careful planning. Elon's role would be more about vision, guiding the colony's long-term strategy. He knew that while his dreams were grand, the reality of Mars required the work of the people, not just a single visionary. The idea was simple: no one person should hold too much power. The council would make decisions together, ensuring that every voice was heard. Elon's singular authority had caused division before, now, they would make decisions collectively, as a unified body. Now that the internal strife was somewhat settled, the focus could shift back to the colony's survival. The critical systems, water, oxygen, food, had all been patched up, but the long-term sustainability of the colony remained an open question. Ethan Carter, the colony's lead engineer, had spent the days since the summit working on a long-term infrastructure plan. He was optimistic, despite the setbacks. The base can withstand the next Martian dust storm. It's not perfect, but it's more than we've had in the past. They were also working on a more efficient oxygen generation system, and the next step was expanding the greenhouses to grow more food. Elon had always envisioned Mars as a place where humanity could not only survive but thrive. The day-to-day struggle to survive on Mars was one thing, but they also had to build sustainability into the colony. Maria led the way in spearheading the psychological health of the settlers. She introduced weekly counseling sessions and discussions designed to keep morale high. She'd seen the toll that constant tension had taken on the crew's well-being and understood the importance of mental health in such a confined, isolated environment. The real turning point, however, came when Elon gathered the colony for a special announcement. The settlers had been working tirelessly on the base's systems, and now, they were ready for the next phase. Elon stood before them, his voice more confident than it had been in months. "I know the past has been difficult," he began. "But we have accomplished something extraordinary. We've survived, we've faced challenges, and now, we can look ahead. Together, we will begin the next phase of this mission." The settlers sat in silence, listening intently. Elon could feel the weight of their gazes on him, but now, instead of doubt, there was a sense of cautious optimism. "The next phase," he continued, "is about growth. We're going to begin developing a permanent settlement. We'll start expanding the base, building the infrastructure we need to make this colony self-sustaining. But most importantly, we will start making the dream of Mars a reality. A place where humanity can thrive, live, and grow. A place that's ours." There was a palpable shift in the room. Elon knew that, while they had faced intense divisions, the shared purpose of making Mars humanity's second home was enough to unite them once again. As the days passed and the colony settled into this new era, Elon found himself staring out at the Martian landscape once again, much like he had in the early days. But now, he saw it with new eyes. Mars was no longer an unknown. It was a home, albeit a fragile one, but a home that they had built together. And for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to imagine what might come next. Not just Mars. But the next steps in humanity's journey, toward the moon, toward other planets, and beyond. The work ahead would be difficult. The challenges would be many. But Elon knew one thing for sure: they were no longer fighting just to survive. They were building something that would last, something that would carry humanity into the future. The sound of tools clanking against metal echoed through the Martian base as Elon Musk walked through the sprawling colony. What had once been a sparse outpost, struggling to stay alive, was now a thriving hub of activity. The colony was no longer just a testbed for human survival, it was growing, evolving into something far more ambitious. But as their success on Mars expanded, so too did the potential dangers that loomed on the horizon. The next phase of their mission was clear: expansion. With their systems stable, they were ready to extend the colony, building new habitats, greenhouses, and research facilities. Elon had always dreamed of creating a self-sustaining society on Mars, but the reality of it was far more complex, and dangerous, than he had imagined. The first step in their expansion was to build a new habitat. Unlike the original base, which had been a series of connected modules hastily assembled, this new habitat would be a permanent structure, capable of supporting a larger population and withstanding the harsh Martian environment. The engineers, led by Marco Delgado, had drawn up plans for a series of interconnected domes that would serve as living quarters, research labs, and recreation areas. Maria had already begun the groundwork for the colony's psychological health, understanding that a larger population would bring with it new stresses. It wasn't just about surviving Mars, it was about living there, truly living. The small community they had once been, a tight-knit group of pioneers, was now growing into something larger, more diverse, and more complex. It was no longer just about daily survival. It was about creating a new world. However, as they moved forward with their plans, they encountered unforeseen challenges. The first hurdle came in the form of the Martian environment itself. The radiation levels on Mars were far higher than Earth's, and while their habitats were designed with radiation shielding, the sheer scale of expansion meant that they would need to find new ways to mitigate exposure, especially for larger populations. Elon's dream of a thriving settlement on Mars had always been bold, but the technicalities were proving far more challenging than anyone had anticipated. Ethan Carter, the lead engineer, spent countless hours in the base's makeshift workshop, running simulations and recalculating their resources. The colony's power supply, which had once been sufficient for a small crew, was now barely able to support the expansion needs. The addition of new habitats meant more energy, more water, more food, and more waste to manage. Everything had to be scaled up, but their infrastructure was struggling to keep up. The solar arrays can only handle so much, Ethan said, his brow furrowed as he looked over the energy output data. We need a new power source, or we're going to be running on fumes in a matter of months. Elon's mind raced. He knew the stakes were high. If they didn't secure a more reliable power source, the expansion would come to a screeching halt. He turned to Maria, who was now becoming his closest confidant on matters beyond just leadership. We need to act fast, Elon said, urgency in his voice. Do we have any options? Maria thought for a moment. We could try to harness nuclear power. It's a risk, but it might be the only way forward. The technology has been tested, and we know how to build compact reactors. Elon wasn't thrilled by the idea. Nuclear energy always carried a certain degree of danger, but he also knew that desperate times called for desperate measures. Mars didn't have the luxury of alternatives. All right, Elon said, let's explore it. We don't have much choice. As the expansion continued, new problems arose, many of them unpredictable. One of the most pressing issues was the sudden increase in Martian dust storms. These storms were a common phenomenon on Mars, but recently, they had become more frequent and more intense. The storms interfered with the solar arrays, blocking sunlight and reducing power output for days at a time. We can't keep up with these storms, Marco said during one of their meetings. The frequency is increasing. We've got to find a way to build shields or some kind of weather-resistant system to protect our infrastructure. The dust storms weren't the only threat. The colony was also facing psychological strain as the population grew. While the settlers had weathered the initial challenges of isolation, the growing pressure of expansion, combined with the harsh conditions of Mars, was beginning to take its toll. Maria had been working overtime, implementing group therapy sessions and one-on-one counseling for the settlers, but the emotional strain of living in such a hostile environment was beginning to show in unexpected ways. People were starting to snap under the pressure. Elon knew that the colony couldn't afford to fail, not now. The stakes were higher than ever, and the success of this mission wasn't just about them anymore. It was about proving that humanity could overcome anything and settle on another planet. The dream of Mars as a second home was becoming more real by the day, but it was a dream teetering on the edge of catastrophe. Despite the challenges, Elon remained undeterred. He knew that the expansion on Mars was just the first step. His vision had always been bigger, beyond Mars, to the Moon, and then to other planets. He was certain that if they could build a sustainable human presence on Mars, they could use that as a launchpad for further exploration. "Elon, we're getting to a point where we need to think beyond Mars," Maria said one evening, as they sat together in the colony's observation room. Through the thick glass, the Martian landscape stretched out in all its red, desolate beauty. "I know," Elon replied, staring at the horizon. "Mars is just the beginning. If we can make it here, we can go anywhere. The moons of Jupiter, even beyond the solar system eventually. It's all within reach." Maria nodded slowly, as if weighing the gravity of his words. "But we need to survive here first, Elon. We can't keep pushing forward if we don't solve these problems now." Elon took a deep breath. He understood the enormity of the task. Mars was a stepping stone, but they couldn't skip the hard work of building a viable, sustainable colony. If they were going to truly reach beyond Mars, they had to get the basics right first. It had been nearly 2 years since Elon Musk and the settlers had arrived on Mars, and the colony had come a long way. From a handful of people barely scraping by, they had now built an infrastructure capable of supporting a much larger population. But the dream of a thriving, self-sustaining human presence on Mars was teetering on the edge of collapse. The expansion was faltering. The Martian dust storms were becoming more frequent, the energy crisis was intensifying, and the psychological toll on the settlers was harder to ignore. Elon knew that they had reached a critical juncture. If they couldn't solve these issues quickly, the colony might not survive. The dream of Mars might slip away, and with it, the very future of humanity in space. The day began like any other. Elon was in the command center, reviewing the daily reports, when a sudden alert flashed across his screen. The power grid was failing. "We've got a problem," Ethan Carter's voice crackled over the intercom. "The backup systems are running at overload. If we don't get more power soon, we'll lose critical systems, air filtration, water processing, heating. It's going to affect the entire colony." Elon's stomach dropped. This wasn't just a minor glitch. This was a ticking time bomb. In the early days of the settlement, they had relied on solar panels for energy, supplemented by small nuclear reactors. But the expansion had stretched their resources too thin. The solar arrays, while still functional, couldn't keep up with the energy demand of the growing colony, and the nuclear power option had yet to be brought online. "I need options," Elon said sharply. "How soon can we get the nuclear reactors online?" "We're not ready yet," Ethan replied. "The reactors need a full inspection before we can power them up, and that's going to take time we don't have." Elon stood up and began pacing. Time was the one thing they didn't have. He turned to Maria, who had been sitting quietly in the corner of the command center. She was watching him closely, aware of the weight of the situation. "We can't afford to wait. If we don't get this sorted out, we're going to lose everything we've worked for," Elon said, his voice strained. Maria didn't speak immediately. She simply nodded, understanding the magnitude of the challenge they were facing. The settlers weren't just relying on Mars for their future, they were relying on each other. The crisis wasn't limited to the power grid. There was a growing sense of unease among the settlers, and it was starting to show. The constant tension of living on Mars, coupled with the ever-present threat of failure, was pushing everyone to their limits. Maria had been working tirelessly with the settlers on mental health initiatives, but as the pressure mounted, even her methods weren't enough. People were starting to break. Some had withdrawn into themselves, while others lashed out in frustration. The community was beginning to fracture. During a routine therapy session, Maria sat with Dr. Rowe, the lead scientist who had once been part of the rebel faction. Dr. Rowe's face was drawn, the weight of the stress taking its toll on her as well. "I can't keep doing this, Maria," Dr. Rowe confessed, her voice shaky. "I came to Mars because I believed in the mission, but every day it feels like we're just spinning our wheels. I don't know how much longer I can keep going." Maria's heart ached for her. She knew the toll this was taking on everyone. The settlers had come to Mars hoping for something new, something bold. But now they were facing the harsh reality of survival on another planet, and it was breaking them down. "I understand," Maria said softly. "But we can't give up. Not now. We've come too far." Yet, even as she spoke those words, Maria couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that things were slipping out of their control. Mars was a harsh and unforgiving world, and it was testing them in ways they hadn't anticipated. Back in the command center, Elon gathered his closest team members to discuss their options. The power crisis was critical, but it wasn't the only issue at hand. The mental toll, the ongoing dust storms, and the lack of resources were all stacking up against them. "We need to make a decision," Elon said, his voice tight with urgency. "If the nuclear reactors can't be brought online in time, we need to find an alternative power source, fast." Ethan and Marco began brainstorming possible solutions. After several hours of heated discussion, they came up with a desperate plan. They would tap into the base's water supply and use it to generate hydroelectric power. It was a long shot, but it was their only viable option at the moment. "We'll need to repurpose the water filtration system and reroute the supply," Marco explained, "but it can work. If we can get the power flowing, we'll buy ourselves some time." Elon didn't hesitate. "Do it. Whatever it takes." As the hours passed, the power situation grew more dire. The colony's systems were barely holding on, and everyone was on edge. Elon had always prided himself on his ability to keep calm under pressure, but even he felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. In the midst of all this, Maria received a troubling message from one of the medical officers. A settler had gone missing. It wasn't the first time someone had wandered off, but this time, something felt different. The search teams were dispatched immediately, but it was clear that the missing settler, a young engineer named Josh, had disappeared without a trace. The implications were more severe than they seemed. With the colony stretched thin and morale plummeting, the disappearance of one of their own only deepened the sense of unease. Elon stood at the command center window, staring out at the vast, inhospitable Martian landscape. The world outside seemed as cold and distant as the colony's future. But they couldn't afford to give up. Not now. Not yet. The Martian evening was eerily silent, broken only by the occasional hum of machines and the distant, muffled thrum of air filtration systems. But inside the command center, the atmosphere was anything but calm. Tension hung in the air like a storm cloud, thick and oppressive. Elon paced back and forth, his mind racing with thoughts of the missing engineer and the power crisis that continued to spiral out of control. Every passing moment brought them closer to a breaking point. How could this happen? Maria's voice was quiet, filled with both concern and disbelief as she stood beside Elon, looking at the flashing red alerts on the command screen. "People are cracking under pressure," Elon replied, running a hand through his hair. "The power's almost out, and the psychological strain, it's too much for some to bear." Maria's eyes flicked toward the screen showing the location of the missing settler, Josh. The red dot indicated that the search teams were still scouring the surrounding area, but nothing had been found. "We need to keep searching for Josh," she said firmly, but we also can't ignore the fact that the colony is on the brink of collapse. We need a solution, and fast. Elon nodded grimly, knowing she was right. The colony was stretched to the breaking point. If Josh was still out there, lost in the Martian wilderness, they had to find him before it was too late. But even more pressing were the growing signs that the infrastructure was failing, the power outages were becoming more frequent, the life support systems were on the verge of shutting down, and the dust storms were intensifying, cutting off any hope of replenishing their solar energy. Hours turned into days as the search for Josh continued, but with every passing hour, hope seemed to fade further. Elon couldn't help but feel the weight of the colony's failure bearing down on him. This was supposed to be the beginning of something great, the first step in making humanity a multiplanetary species. But now, as the settlers faced their darkest hour, it seemed like everything was slipping through his fingers. Maria could see the strain in his eyes, the self-doubt creeping in as the failure of their mission became ever more apparent. She had spent countless hours in therapy sessions with the crew, helping them process their emotions and fears, but even she was running out of answers. There was only so much anyone could endure before the psychological toll became unbearable. The isolation of Mars, the constant threat of failure, and the never-ending struggle for survival had become too much for some. There were whispers in the hallways, uncertain voices asking whether it was worth it anymore. Should they abandon Mars? Should they return to Earth and admit defeat? The idea of failure loomed large. But Elon wouldn't entertain the thought of giving up. He had built his entire career on taking risks, on pushing the boundaries of what was possible. To turn back now would be a betrayal of everything they had worked for. As the power supply dwindled and the dust storm began to rage outside, Elon called a crisis meeting with his core team. There was no time to waste. The nuclear reactors were still not ready, and the water-powered generators were nowhere near sufficient to keep the colony running. We have two choices, Elon said, standing at the head of the table, his voice steady despite the mounting pressure. We can either gamble everything on the reactors, or we can take a drastic measure and try to tap into the Martian underground for geothermal energy. It's untested, but it could be our last chance. Ethan and Marco exchanged glances. The idea of drilling into the Martian crust to harness geothermal power was risky. The technology hadn't been fully tested, and it carried the potential for disaster. A geothermal failure could lead to catastrophic damage to the base, and they couldn't afford to make another mistake. Geothermal is a long shot, Marco said slowly, but if we don't act now, we'll lose everything. The colony can't survive much longer without power. Elon took a deep breath. He understood the stakes. They had already lost so much. He didn't want to risk even more, but the alternative was clear, they couldn't afford to fail. We do it, Elon said finally. Prepare the drilling rigs. Get everything in place. We don't have the luxury of time. As the team prepared for the geothermal drilling operation, Elon's mind was consumed with the weight of their situation. They were gambling everything on an untested solution. If it worked, they could power the colony for years to come. But if it didn't, the consequences would be disastrous. In the meantime, Maria worked to keep the settlers' morale intact. She held a series of group sessions, trying to keep everyone focused and hopeful despite the bleak reality. But she could see the doubt in their eyes, the fear that this might be the end. Elon's doing everything he can, she told them, her voice firm. But we all need to stick together. We're in this as a team, and together, we'll get through this. Her words had the effect she hoped for, if only for a brief moment. The settlers nodded, trying to take solace in the idea that their survival depended on their unity. As the drilling teams began their work, Elon, Maria, and the rest of the core team gathered around the central command console, anxiously watching the data as it streamed in. The ground beneath Mars was a mystery, and they had no idea what they were about to encounter. The heat readings from the drill started coming through, and for a moment, it seemed like they had struck gold. The temperature readings were higher than expected, suggesting that there was a viable geothermal pocket beneath them. But then something unexpected happened, the temperature spiked even higher. The drill system began to shake, warning lights flashing red across the board. "What's happening?" Elon demanded, his voice sharp with fear. "Heat levels are too high," Ethan said, his fingers flying across the controls. It's unstable. If we don't pull back, we'll cause a catastrophic meltdown." Elon's heart raced. They were on the verge of a disaster. The geothermal gamble had just become an even greater risk, one that could destroy everything they had worked for. The air inside the command center was thick with tension, every breath feeling heavier than the last. The warning alarms blared relentlessly, filling the room with an urgent, metallic shriek. Elon's mind raced as he stared at the fluctuating data on the screen, his eyes locked on the temperature readings that had skyrocketed to dangerous levels. "Shut it down!" Elon shouted. His voice was a mix of urgency and command. "Now!" Ethan's fingers moved over the controls in a blur, trying to override the system and halt the drilling process before it could go any further. But the temperature spikes weren't just a sign of failure, they were a warning. The ground beneath them was unstable, and the geothermal potential they had hoped to tap into was now threatening to tear the base apart. "Too late!" Ethan cried out. "We can't stop it. It's going to breach." The word sent a chill down Elon's spine. They were running out of time, the colony was on the verge of a catastrophic meltdown. There was no safety protocol for something like this, no backup systems that could contain the disaster they were about to face. The drill was already burrowing too deep into the Martian crust, and the heat was building faster than anyone had anticipated. "Elon, we need to get everyone out of here." Marco's voice cut through the chaos, his face pale as he scanned the monitors. "If we don't evacuate now, we'll lose everything. The whole colony could collapse." Elon felt a wave of panic, but he quickly squashed it. He had faced moments of uncertainty before, but this was different. This wasn't just about making a tough call, it was about survival. "We can't just abandon everything," Elon said, his voice firm despite the rising fear in his chest. "We've come too far. If we leave now, it's all over. I'm not letting that happen." But even as he said the words, the weight of the situation began to sink in. The colony had already been stretched to its limits. The power outages, the psychological strain, the harsh Martian environment, it was all coming to a head. If the geothermal drill triggered a volcanic eruption, or worse, a seismic event, there might be no coming back from it. With no time to waste, Elon turned to the team. "We need a plan B, something to stabilize the drill before we lose control." Ethan was still furiously working the controls, trying to slow the drilling process, but the system was too far gone. The readings on the monitors were flashing red, indicating that the heat pressure was building at an unprecedented rate. "We can't stop the drill," Ethan said, his voice low and defeated. "We've reached the point of no return. All we can do now is try to contain the damage." Marco, who had been silently analyzing the data, looked up with a grim expression. "We need to try cooling the drill head. I'm not sure how much time we have, but we could use the colony's liquid nitrogen reserve. If we inject it into the drill shaft, it could temporarily lower the pressure. It's risky, but it might work." Elon's eyes flashed with determination. The plan was dangerous, but it was their last shot. "Do it. We don't have another choice." Within minutes, the team worked together to reroute the liquid nitrogen to the drill shaft. The cooling system activated, and for a brief moment, the temperature readings began to stabilize. But Elon knew they couldn't relax just yet. This was only a temporary fix. They had bought themselves some time, but the clock was still ticking. "We need to prepare for the worst," Elon said, his voice barely above a whisper. "If the situation escalates, we may have to consider evacuation." As the team worked tirelessly to keep the situation under control, Elon retreated to a quiet corner of the command center, his mind whirling with thoughts of the colony's future. The pressure was suffocating. He had always known that building a colony on Mars would be fraught with challenges, but nothing had prepared him for the sheer weight of responsibility that came with it. The settlers were counting on him. The future of humanity on Mars was resting on his shoulders. But the cracks were starting to show. The colony was breaking down, physically and mentally. The dream of a thriving settlement on Mars was beginning to feel like an impossible ideal. Elon. Maria's voice broke through his thoughts, soft but filled with concern. He turned to face her, his eyes tired but focused. What's the situation? Better, for now, Maria said, her expression a mix of relief and apprehension. The nitrogen is holding the temperature down, but we're still far from out of danger. If we don't find a permanent solution soon, we could lose everything. Elon took a deep breath, his hands gripping the edge of a console. The weight of the decision he was about to make was overwhelming. He couldn't keep pushing the team like this, not with the power systems failing, the psychological strain taking its toll, and now the geothermal project threatening to destroy everything they had built. We're on the edge of something, Elon said, his voice barely a whisper. Either we pull through, or we don't. Maria placed a hand on his shoulder, her eyes filled with empathy. We'll find a way. Together, we can figure this out. You don't have to carry this alone. Elon didn't respond immediately. The truth was, he had never felt more isolated in his entire life. He had always been the one with the answers, the one who could chart the course forward. But now, on Mars, facing a crisis that no one had ever anticipated, the answers weren't as clear as they once were. As the hours dragged on, the cooling system continued to hold, but Elon couldn't shake the feeling that this was just a temporary reprieve. They needed a long-term solution, and fast. But as the team gathered to discuss their next move, a message came through that stopped everything cold. We found him. Marco's voice was full of disbelief. The missing engineer, Josh, had been found. He was alive, but barely. The search team had discovered him stumbling through the storm, disoriented but otherwise unharmed. Elon felt a wave of relief wash over him. The worst of their immediate crisis had been averted, but the bigger picture remained unchanged. They had to stabilize the colony. They had to fix Mars before it destroyed them all. The command center had fallen into a temporary silence after the news that Josh had been found. Relief was palpable in the air, but it wasn't enough to erase the lingering tension that had been building up for days. The temporary fix for the geothermal breach had bought them time, but only a little. The reality of their situation hung over them like a dark cloud, and everyone knew it. Elon stood at the head of the room, his eyes scanning the faces of the settlers who had gathered for a crucial meeting. Maria, Marco, Ethan, and the rest of the team were there, each of them looking worn out, their expressions reflecting the gravity of the decisions that lay ahead. The sudden recovery of Josh felt like a brief moment of hope, but as Elon stood before them, he could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. They were no longer just trying to survive, they were now facing an even harder choice. It was make or break time. We've come a long way, Elon began, his voice steady but tinged with exhaustion. But we're at a crossroads. The question now isn't whether we can make Mars work. It's whether we should. The words hung in the air, thick with meaning. Should they continue this mission? Could they salvage the dream of a thriving colony on Mars, or had they reached the end of the road? The silence in the room was deafening. No one spoke at first. Then, Maria broke the quiet, her voice soft but firm. We can't give up now, Elon. Not after everything we've been through. Mars isn't just a project anymore. It's our home. Elon's eyes met hers, and for a moment, he saw the same fierce determination he had always held for the mission. But was that enough? He took a deep breath, looking around at the team. Each face told a different story of hardship, of sacrifice, of endurance. But as much as he wanted to keep pushing forward, there was something in the back of his mind whispering that perhaps this wasn't the time to keep fighting. The stakes were higher than ever. The power system was still on life support, the geothermal drilling had almost destroyed them, and their food and water reserves were dangerously low. Time was running out, and the colony was teetering on the edge of collapse. Elon thought about Earth, the home they had left behind. It felt like a lifetime ago, a world far removed from the cold, barren landscape of Mars. If they returned to Earth now, they could get back to their lives, start over. There would be no shame in admitting defeat. No one would blame them. But the mission wasn't just about them anymore. It was about the future of humanity. They were pioneers, the first to try to settle a new world. Could they walk away from that? I know what you're thinking, Elon said, his voice quiet now. We've all put everything into this. But the reality is that we might not make it. We're facing conditions no one could have predicted. This colony is fragile, and at the rate we're going, we're out of time. The room was filled with the sound of nervous murmurs, everyone feeling the weight of what he was saying. Could they really abandon their dream? Could they turn their backs on the mission and everything they had sacrificed for? We didn't come here just to survive, Marco said, his voice hoarse. We came here to build something bigger than ourselves. Something that will last. We also didn't come here to die, Ethan added. Mars is unforgiving. We've all seen that. But if we leave, what have we accomplished? Nothing. Elon looked at each of them. The decision had never felt heavier. To stay would mean gambling everything, their lives, the future of Mars, the dreams of every person who had supported them. To leave would be an admission of failure, a confession that the impossible dream had been, after all, just that, impossible. A sudden thought crossed Elon's mind. He could make the decision himself. He was the leader, the one everyone looked to for guidance. But the weight of the decision felt too big, too final to carry alone. He looked at the team again, his eyes meeting theirs with a question unspoken. We need to decide, he said finally. It's not a question of if we can do it anymore. It's about whether we're willing to keep going. I'm asking you all to decide, do we keep fighting for Mars? The room fell into deep silence. The settlers exchanged uneasy glances, each person grappling with the enormity of what Elon was asking. It wasn't just a question of survival anymore, it was a question of purpose. Could they continue to endure the hardships? Could they justify the risk? After what felt like an eternity, Maria was the first to speak. I vote that we keep going, she said firmly, her gaze locked with Elon's. We're all in this together. If we leave now, we're giving up on something we've already started. Elon felt a swell of gratitude for her words, but he knew this wasn't just about hope, it was about pragmatism. But when he looked around the room, he saw the same spark in the eyes of his team. They weren't ready to quit. Not yet. One by one, the others spoke up, each reaffirming their commitment to the mission. Marco, Ethan, and even the more reluctant crew members voiced their support, each understanding the gravity of the decision but unwilling to let the dream die. And so, in the end, the vote was unanimous. They would continue to fight for Mars. They would keep pushing, no matter the odds. As the team reaffirmed their commitment to Mars, Elon couldn't help but feel the weight of the decision lifting from his shoulders. The path forward was still unclear, fraught with challenges and dangers, but there was something undeniably powerful in the collective decision. They were not alone in this anymore. The future of the colony wasn't just his, it belonged to them all. As the settlers left the room, they did so with renewed purpose, ready to face the challenges ahead. They knew the road would be difficult, but they were no longer fighting for survival alone, they were fighting for a shared dream. And as Elon watched them go, he felt a sense of resolve settle deep within him. They were all in this together. No matter what happened next, they would face it as one. The days following the unanimous decision to stay were filled with a sense of renewed purpose. While the immediate danger of the geothermal drill had been temporarily mitigated, the long-term challenges loomed large. The colonists had made their choice, they would continue to fight for their future on Mars, despite the risks, despite the hardships. In the command center, the air was different. There was a palpable shift in energy, a sense that something had changed in all of them. Where there had once been doubt, now there was resolve. The room, which had been filled with anxiety just days before, now buzzed with activity as the team worked together to secure the colony's future. Elon had never been one to shy away from risk. But now, with his team behind him and the weight of their shared commitment on his shoulders, the stakes felt higher than ever. Every decision they made could be the one that either propelled them forward or sent them spiraling into disaster. The first order of business was the colony's power grid. The solar arrays had been a reliable source of energy, but as the colony expanded, their efficiency had diminished. There were issues with dust storms blocking the sunlight, and the radiation storms were becoming more frequent. They needed a more stable energy source. "We can't keep relying on these solar arrays alone," Marco said, studying the data on his screen. "We've got to diversify our energy sources, something that can give us a constant flow of power." Elon nodded thoughtfully. Nuclear fusion had always been a distant dream, something they discussed in theory but never fully implemented. But now, they were at a point where it was no longer a theoretical challenge. It was an immediate necessity. "If we can get the fusion reactor running, it'll stabilize everything," Elon said, his mind already working through the logistics. "But we need the resources to build it. The mining operations aren't producing enough, and the material we need isn't easily accessible." The challenge of securing the necessary materials was daunting, but not impossible. Mars had plenty of untapped resources, they just had to find a way to extract and process them efficiently. And for the first time in a while, Elon felt the stirrings of something familiar in his chest, a sense of possibility. As the team worked on the power grid, new complications emerged. The last thing they needed was another disaster, but nature had its own plans. A massive dust storm had begun brewing on the horizon, and it was heading straight for the colony. The storm wasn't like the ones they'd faced before. It was a monster, a planet-wide storm that could cut off their access to solar power for weeks. Elon stood at the observation window, staring out at the red sky, his thoughts racing. They had just started to stabilize, to believe they could do this. But this storm could destroy everything they had worked for. "We've got to weather the storm," Elon muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Maria, who had joined him at the window, looked up at him, her face etched with concern. "What's the plan?" "The storm's already growing in intensity." Elon turned toward her. "We've been preparing for this. Our storm shelters are reinforced, and we've got backup systems for communications. But this is going to test us." They needed to ensure the colony's essential systems were protected. If the storm took out the solar arrays, they would be without power for weeks, perhaps longer. The emergency power systems could only hold out for so long. The cold, the isolation, and the dwindling supplies would make the situation even more dire. The days leading up to the storm felt like a strange kind of waiting game. Every member of the team worked tirelessly, double-checking equipment, securing loose structures, and ensuring that every possible measure had been taken to prepare for the worst. But as the storm grew closer, the reality of their situation began to sink in. They weren't just trying to survive anymore, they were fighting for survival. It was no longer about making history, it was about making it through this moment and the next one. Elon found himself in the command center late one evening, poring over the data. The storm was fast approaching, and he couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than just a natural event. The red clouds swirling on the horizon felt like a metaphor for everything they were up against. The storm outside reflected the storm brewing inside him. Was this just a test of their ability to survive? Or was Mars simply too harsh a place for them to thrive? Later that night, when the storm was nearly upon them, Elon stepped outside for a brief moment of quiet. The sky had darkened, casting a haunting red hue over the landscape. The wind howled, carrying dust and debris across the barren plains. Maria joined him, standing in the shadow of the habitat dome. They both stared out at the Martian horizon, lost in thought. "Elon, what if this is too much?" Maria asked, her voice soft. "What if we're pushing too hard?" I mean, we're up against a planet that doesn't care whether we succeed or fail. We could just fail. Elon finished for her. He turned to her, his face serious. Maria, we knew from the beginning that this wouldn't be easy. This planet wasn't going to hand us anything. But we're here now. We've made it this far. Maria nodded slowly. I know. But sometimes it feels like it's too much. We're not just fighting the environment. We're fighting ourselves. Elon gazed at the storm as it approached, its fury reflected in the swirling winds. He was no stranger to adversity, but the scale of this challenge was unlike anything he'd ever faced. It wasn't just about technology or resources. It was about the human spirit. You're right, Elon said quietly. We're fighting ourselves. Our fears. Our doubts. But we can't stop. Not now. The storm arrived the next morning with a force unlike anything they had anticipated. The winds howled at hurricane speeds, and the dust storm blotted out the sun, plunging the colony into utter darkness. The solar arrays, their primary source of power, were rendered useless as the storm tore through the surface. The power grid went down within hours, and the emergency systems kicked in, but they were barely enough to maintain basic life support. The temperature inside the colony began to drop, and the atmosphere grew tense with the realization that they might not make it through the storm intact. But in the midst of the chaos, there was something else, something they hadn't expected. As the storm raged outside, the colonists came together. They worked in unison, each person taking on whatever task was needed. The colony wasn't just surviving, it was fighting back. In the darkest hours of the storm, Elon found himself standing side by side with his team, fighting for the one thing they all had in common, hope. The storm raged on for days. What had begun as a distant threat had transformed into an all-consuming, relentless force. The wind howled outside, carrying with it the suffocating red dust that obscured everything. The colony, usually a beacon of hope in the vast emptiness of Mars, had become a small, fragile island in an ocean of chaos. Inside the habitat, the air was tense, thick with the weight of uncertainty. The power grid was barely holding up, and they were running low on backup resources. The temperature inside the colony was dropping steadily, and every corner of the dome was filled with the hum of emergency systems trying to compensate for the lack of energy. It had been 5 days since the storm began. The food and water supply were still holding, but for how much longer? And the most pressing concern, the health of the settlers. The prolonged exposure to the cold and the oppressive dust storm was beginning to take its toll on their physical and mental well-being. Elon had spent most of his time in the command center, going over the data and trying to keep his mind focused on the task at hand. But the constant, gnawing worry about the colony's future was always present, lurking in the back of his mind. The others, too, were starting to show signs of strain, fatigue, irritability, and a growing sense of desperation. The most pressing issue was still the power. The fusion reactor was still in the early stages of development, and with the storm blocking out the sun, they couldn't rely on the solar arrays. It was clear that, without a reliable power source, their survival was in jeopardy. The colony's systems, life support, communication, water filtration, relied on power, and without it, their situation would deteriorate quickly. "We've got to get the reactor online," Marco said, his face tense as he stared at the display in front of him. "We need that power, or we'll be in serious trouble. This storm isn't going anywhere anytime soon." "I know," Elon replied, his voice tight. He stood next to Marco, looking at the diagrams of the reactor. "But we don't have enough resources to build it properly. The mining operations are stalled, and the last thing we need is to try and force something that isn't ready. Do we have any other options?" Marco asked. Elon hesitated, his mind racing. They had a backup plan for situations like this, a way to ration energy and prioritize critical systems, but it would be a band-aid solution at best. With the storm expected to last at least another few days, they couldn't afford to gamble on something so unreliable. If we're going to survive this, we need to make a decision, Elon said finally, his voice taking on a note of finality. We either get the reactor online or we risk the entire colony. There was no room for half measures. The stakes had never been higher. As the days dragged on, the isolation of Mars became all the more apparent. The storm had cut off all communication with Earth. The only thing they had were each other, and that bond was being tested with every passing hour. Maria, who had been acting as the colony's emotional anchor, was starting to feel the weight of the isolation herself. She spent most of her time checking on the other settlers, offering comfort and reassurance where she could, but even her optimism was beginning to fade. There's only so much we can do, she said quietly to Elon one evening as they stood in the dimly lit hallway. People are starting to crack under the pressure. It's hard to keep morale up when we don't even know if we'll make it through this. Elon looked at her, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion. I know, Maria. But we can't give up. We can't show weakness. Maria gave a short laugh, though it held no mirth. Isn't that what you're doing, Elon? Pretending like you're not afraid? He looked away, the weight of her words hitting harder than he expected. The truth was, he was terrified. Not just for his own life, but for the lives of everyone on Mars with him. If they didn't make it, it would be because of his leadership, his vision, his inability to get them through the hardest moments. But as much as he wanted to admit that fear, he couldn't. Not in front of them. Not yet. It was during the 6th night of the storm when everything began to unravel. The emergency systems that had been running on backup power suddenly faltered. One by one, the lights flickered and went out, and the colony was plunged into complete darkness. The hum of the life support systems died away, leaving behind an eerie silence that was only broken by the sound of the wind howling outside. No. No, no, no. Marco shouted, slamming his fist against the control panel. This can't be happening. Elon rushed into the command center, his heart racing. He knew what had happened, the power had completely gone out. With the storm blocking the solar arrays and the backup systems drained, the colony was now functioning on nothing more than the barest amount of power. We're running out of time, Elon said, his voice barely audible over the rising panic. We need to restore power immediately, or we won't make it through this. Marco was already scrambling to reroute the remaining energy, his fingers flying across the controls. I'm trying, but it's all shot. The circuits are overloaded. We can't sustain life support without the reactor. Elon glanced at Maria, who was standing at the door, her expression one of sheer helplessness. We can't do this without the reactor, Elon said. We have to get it online. We're too far behind, Elon. Marco snapped, frustration coloring his tone. We've been trying to keep this together for days, but we can't just keep pushing with nothing. We're out of resources. The gravity of the situation hit Elon like a punch to the stomach. There was no more time to doubt, no more time to worry about the what-ifs. The colony's future had already been decided in these moments, survival or failure. It was all or nothing. Elon stood there for a moment, paralyzed by the enormity of the decision ahead. They could either abandon the colony and risk losing everything, or they could double down and try to force the reactor online. It would take everything they had. The command center was a dim, flickering chaos. Emergency lights cast an eerie, red glow across the room as Elon, Marco, and the rest of the team scrambled in frantic desperation. The storm outside had reached its peak intensity, a monstrous swirl of red dust and violent winds, but it wasn't just the external forces they were fighting now. It was the sheer weight of the cold, darkness, and silence creeping into their fragile sanctuary. Elon stared at the malfunctioning screens in front of him, his fingers trembling as he tried to make sense of the data. The backup systems were failing one by one, and the air felt increasingly thin. Every second counted. They couldn't afford another mistake. Elon, Marco said, his voice tense, we need to get the fusion reactor running. If we don't, we'll lose everything. But we don't have the resources, this is a last-ditch effort. We're risking it all. Elon looked at Marco, his heart pounding in his chest. They were on the edge, staring into the abyss. The weight of the decision was crushing. If they tried to force the reactor online and it failed, there was no backup. No plan B. You're right, Elon said quietly, his voice steady but filled with an unmistakable sense of resolve. But we don't have a choice, Marco. If we don't do this, we lose everything. We'll never get another shot. Marco nodded grimly. Then we're all in. Let's do it. The team moved quickly, their movements mechanical but purposeful. Elon oversaw the preparations as Marco and his team tried to stabilize the remaining components of the fusion reactor. It was a race against time, and the stakes had never been higher. The storm outside showed no signs of relenting, and the power levels inside the colony were rapidly plummeting. We've bypassed the damaged circuits, Marco reported, sweat dripping down his forehead. But we don't know how long this temporary fix will hold. It's all or nothing. Elon stood at the console, his fingers brushing against the cold, sterile buttons. He felt the weight of the entire colony's future in this moment. Every person on Mars, every life in that habitat, was depending on this one decision. This gamble. He took a deep breath. There was no turning back. We're doing this, he said, more to himself than anyone else. He pressed the button. For a moment, nothing happened. Elon's heart raced as he stared at the reactor's display. The seconds stretched out, like hours. Had it failed? Was it over? Then, without warning, the lights flickered, then stabilized. A soft hum began to fill the room, steady at first, then growing louder. The fusion reactor was coming to life. Slowly, the systems began to stabilize. The colony's power grid sputtered back into action, the emergency lights dimming as the main lights came online. Yes. Marco shouted. We've got power. Elon exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. It wasn't a complete success just yet, but it was enough. The fusion reactor had come online. The power was flowing, and the colony was back from the brink. The relief in the room was palpable, but the work wasn't over. They needed to ensure the reactor remained stable, and that the storm didn't break their fragile progress. As the storm continued to howl outside, Elon gathered the team together in the central hub. It had been a grueling, exhausting ordeal. They had pushed themselves to the absolute limit, but for now, they had won. Team, Elon began, his voice full of gratitude and fatigue, I know we've been through hell. And I know the road ahead is still uncertain. But right now, we've done the impossible. We've made it through. Maria, who had been quiet for most of the storm, finally spoke. Her voice was tired but hopeful. We're not just surviving anymore. We're building something. Together. Elon nodded. Exactly. And we're not done yet. There's still so much to do. But today, we take a moment to breathe. To celebrate the fact that we're still here. The team exchanged weary but relieved glances. They had made it through the worst of the storm. But more challenges were sure to come. Later that evening, when the storm finally began to lose its ferocity, Elon found himself standing alone in front of the observation window. The wind still howled outside, but the light from the reactor now bathed the colony in a soft glow. Mars, as always, looked harsh and beautiful, a place of both promise and peril. Maria joined him, standing silently by his side for a moment before speaking. We made it, she said, her voice filled with awe. We actually made it. Elon turned to her, his eyes tired but filled with a quiet determination. Yeah, we did. But this is just the beginning. We've survived the storm, but there will be more. There's always more. And we have to keep moving forward. Maria nodded, her eyes reflecting the same determination. Together. Elon smiled faintly. Together. The two of them stood there for a while, staring out into the red expanse of Mars, knowing that their survival, their mission, was far from over. But tonight, for the first time in a long while, there was a sense of peace. A sense that they could do this, that Mars was no longer just a distant dream, but a home that they had fought for and, against all odds, were beginning to build. The storm had passed, but the air inside the colony still buzzed with a sense of unease. While the lights now hummed steadily from the fusion reactor, there was an undercurrent of tension that lingered in every corner of the colony. The team had fought through the worst of the storm, but now they had to face the consequences of their gamble and the long road ahead. The fusion reactor was stable, but not without its problems. Power levels fluctuated unpredictably, and the temperature control systems were still shaky. The backup resources had been pushed to their limits, and any further failure would spell disaster. "Is the reactor holding steady?" Elon asked as he walked into the command center the following morning, his eyes scanning the displays. Marco was already at the console, running diagnostics. "It's holding for now, but we've got issues," he replied, his face drawn and serious. "We've managed to patch things together, but there's a limit to how much we can rely on these temporary fixes. We need more resources, more reliable equipment, to make this sustainable." Elon nodded, his mind already running through possible solutions. He knew the next few weeks would be critical. More supplies were essential, but the storm had wrecked any chance of receiving shipments from Earth. They were cut off, alone in the vast emptiness of Mars, with only their wits and their dwindling resources to see them through. Meanwhile, the mood among the settlers was shifting. The initial relief after the storm had passed was fading, and fear was beginning to replace it. The sense of unity that had helped them survive the storm was now fraying at the edges. Diana, the colony's lead biologist, had been working around the clock to stabilize their agricultural systems. Her lab was a small, cramped space in the lower levels of the habitat, and it was always filled with the soft hum of hydroponic systems and the scent of freshly grown greens. It had been one of the few successes they had on Mars, a small but growing supply of food that could sustain them. But even Diana's optimism was beginning to falter. She had just run another series of tests, and the results were troubling. The soil samples they had received from Mars were less fertile than expected, and the crops that had grown so far were showing signs of depletion. "Elon," Diana said when she finally found him, looking more exhausted than ever. "We've got a problem. The crops we're growing are starting to lose their vitality. The nutrient levels are off. We need a solution, and fast. Otherwise, we'll run out of food." Elon stood still for a moment, the weight of her words sinking in. The storm had made everything harder, but now they were facing a crisis on another front. They had planned for food shortages, but not this early. Not when they had just started to rebuild. "We'll figure it out," Elon said, trying to sound confident. But deep down, the growing unease was creeping up again. The unknowns were beginning to pile up. As the days went on, internal tensions began to surface. There had always been friction in any group, especially when survival was on the line, but now it seemed like everyone was at their breaking point. The stress of the storm had pushed them to the edge, and now, with their resources limited and their future uncertain, the cracks in their unity were beginning to show. Marco and Diana, once close allies, were now at odds over how to prioritize the colony's resources. Marco argued that they needed to focus on the reactor, keeping the power flowing and the habitat operational. Diana, on the other hand, insisted that food production was their most pressing issue. Without crops, they wouldn't survive long enough to see their long-term plans come to fruition. The tension in the command center was palpable as they argued, their voices rising in frustration. "If we don't have power, then the whole colony goes down," Marco shouted. "And if we don't have food, we'll be dead in weeks," Diana fired back. Elon stood at the back of the room, listening to the argument unfold. He knew the stakes, and he knew that neither side was wrong. Survival wasn't a simple equation, it was a series of delicate balances that had to be maintained, and there was no easy answer. Enough, Elon finally interjected, his voice calm but firm. We need to stop bickering and focus on what we can control. Marco, I'll leave the reactor in your hands. Diana, I need you to figure out a way to stabilize the food supply. We'll divide and conquer, but we can't afford to fight amongst ourselves. They both nodded, though their eyes still held a spark of resentment. Elon knew this wouldn't be the last of their disagreements, but for now, he had to push forward. As Elon left the command center, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the brink of something much bigger. The problems they were facing weren't just technical, they were emotional, psychological. The isolation of Mars was starting to take its toll on everyone. And it wasn't just the settlers who were feeling it. Elon himself was beginning to feel the pressure of leading a colony on an entirely new planet. He walked through the central hub, taking in the faces of the people he'd brought together. Each one was playing their part, but none of them were immune to the stress that was mounting. The storm outside had passed, but now a different kind of storm was gathering, a storm within the colony itself. Elon couldn't afford to ignore it. If they were to make it through, they needed more than just technology. They needed unity, and they needed hope. He found himself standing by the observation window once again, looking out over the barren landscape of Mars. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional hum of machinery. The horizon was empty, vast, and unforgiving. But Elon knew that even in the emptiness, there was potential. There was still a chance, a hope, if only they could hold it together. The colony on Mars was quiet, the hum of life support systems and the soft buzz of the fusion reactor the only sounds in the otherwise still habitat. But beneath the surface of that quiet, tensions were mounting, and the weight of survival was pressing down on every single person in the colony. Elon stood in front of the large observation window, staring out into the stark, red landscape of Mars. The sun was setting in the distance, casting long, harsh shadows across the barren plains. It felt like an endless waiting game, waiting for something to break, for someone to step forward with the solution that would turn everything around. But he had long since realized that there would be no single solution. There would be no magical fix, no easy path forward. The people of Mars were going to have to face whatever came next, together. And it was going to take everything they had to survive. Inside the central hub, Elon gathered the team for what was to be a decisive meeting. The mood was different now, there was no room for petty disagreements or hesitation. They were at the end of the line. Team, Elon began, his voice steady, but carrying the weight of the moment. We've been through hell. We've survived storms, we've managed the impossible. But we're not done. Not by a long shot. What we face now isn't just about fixing systems or solving technical problems. It's about unity. We can't afford to let anything divide us. The team sat in silence, but their eyes were focused on him. Even Marco, who had been tense with Diana earlier, gave a small nod of agreement. The rift between them wasn't fully healed, but in this moment, they all understood what was at stake. We have to make a decision, Elon continued. We've been holding on with what we've got, patching things together, hoping for the best. But we're running out of time. The crops are failing. The reactor's unstable. And we can't keep using temporary fixes. We need to take a bold step forward, whether it's finding more resources, or, possibly looking outside this colony for help. There was a pause, and then Marco spoke up. Outside help. Elon, you know as well as I do that we're isolated here. The storm cut us off from Earth, and we don't have the means to send a signal far enough to get a response. There's no way to bring supplies, no way to get reinforcements. Elon nodded slowly. I know. But what I'm saying is that we can't wait for things to improve on their own. We have to take action. I have an idea, something that might sound extreme, but it could give us the chance we need. The room fell into a heavy silence. They all knew what Elon was suggesting, but no one dared speak it aloud just yet. I'm talking about terraforming, Elon said quietly, almost as though he was testing the idea as much as he was presenting it. If we can somehow generate enough power, enough resources, we can create a more livable environment here, maybe even bring back the crops, maybe even stabilize the atmosphere enough for us to start thinking long-term. But it'll take everything we have. Every resource, every bit of energy we can muster. Diana's eyes widened in shock. You're serious? Terraforming Mars is no small feat, Elon. The scale is enormous. It's not just about a few tweaks here and there. We'd need more than what we have, it's beyond our current capabilities. And we'd be gambling with everyone's lives. Elon locked eyes with her. I know. But what other choice do we have? We either do the impossible, or we wait for the inevitable. It's now or never. The room was tense, as everyone processed what was being suggested. It felt like an all-or-nothing gamble. One final, desperate push. As the days passed, the team worked tirelessly to prepare for the daunting task. The air was thick with anxiety, but also determination. No one spoke of failure anymore, only the path ahead. Elon and Marco worked in tandem to stabilize the reactor's power output, while Diana, Maria, and the rest of the team began working on the terraforming protocols. They had to start small, gradually adjusting the atmospheric conditions, releasing gases into the Martian atmosphere to attempt the first steps of creating a more hospitable environment. They didn't know how long it would take. They didn't know if it would work at all. But there was no other option. They had to try. The next few weeks were some of the most intense of their lives. The atmosphere of Mars began to show slight improvements. The crops, which had been on the brink of failure, started showing signs of regrowth. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep hope alive. The colony began to breathe a little easier, knowing that they were pushing the limits of what was possible, and slowly but surely, they were changing Mars. It was early one morning, months later, that Elon stood by the same observation window, staring out at the now changing landscape of Mars. The sky, once a dull red, now had the faintest hint of blue in the distance, a symbol of hope. The temperature was still harsh, but the atmosphere was beginning to shift. The first of the crops had been harvested in what was now being called the greenhouse phase. The reactor, though still fragile, was producing enough power to sustain the colony's needs. And most importantly, the people of Mars were finally starting to believe in the possibility of a future. Maria stepped up beside Elon, looking out at the horizon. We did it, she said softly, a hint of awe in her voice. We actually did it. Elon smiled, but it was a tired, thoughtful smile. We did, he said quietly. And it's only the beginning. As the sun began to rise over Mars, casting its light across the once barren plains, a new dawn had truly begun. The colony had survived the storm. The gamble had paid off. And the people of Mars had finally built something that could last. The challenges of Mars were far from over. The colony would face more storms, more setbacks, and more sacrifices. But for the first time in history, humanity had set foot on a new world and begun to shape it to their will. As for Elon Musk, he stood on the precipice of something much larger than himself, a new chapter for mankind. And he knew, deep down, that the road ahead would require more than just the technology and resources they had fought for. It would require vision, leadership, and an unshakable belief in the future. Mars was no longer just a dream. It was home. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?